The great burning question at the end of the war was how the United States was going to avert a return to the great unemployment of the Depression period of the 1930s. During the last phase of the war, production in the United States was double what it had been in its best pre-war year. And this exceedingly high production had been achieved with 10 million men under arms. There was only one way that the return to the unemployment of the Depression could be averted, and that was by creating foreign markets for our overproduction. This was the economic rationale behind the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of the economy of Europe. The CIA comes into this because the political forces in Western Europe after World War II that were prevailing had been the backbone of the resistance to fascism, and they were the left-wing political parties, principally the communist parties, especially in France and Italy. These parties, knowing that the reconstruction of their economies would bring economic and political dependence on the United States, opposed the Marshall Plan. And the CIA was partly set up in order to combat, on a political warfare basis, the efforts by left-wing political organizations in Europe to impede the success of the Marshall Plan. The CIA, from the very beginning, at least as early as 1951, has used the information that it has collected. And it has used the information in order to penetrate and to manipulate the institutions of power in whatever country it is operating in order to influence the course of events in those countries. And essentially, this boils down to propping up those forces which are considered to be the friendly forces, and in penetrating, dividing, weakening, and ultimately destroying those forces which are considered to be the enemy forces. The institutions of power which are penetrated and attempts are made to manipulate them are the political parties, the security services, the military institutions, the trade union organizations especially, the youth and student movements, cultural organizations, professional societies, and in a very big way, the public information media. One of the principal mechanisms which the CIA used after World War II in its programs to influence the course of events in different countries was the use of front organizations. For example, in the youth field, the CIA set up the World Assembly of Youth, which continues today with its headquarters in Brussels. In the student field, the CIA set up the Coordinating Secretariat of National Unions of Students. In the trade union field, the CIA founded, or helped to found, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions with its headquarters in Brussels, which continues to exist today. The purpose of all these different activities, the political and the front organizations in the different sectors of the population, were to fill this political vacuum that existed after World War II, and to fill it with those forces which would be favorable to close relations with the United States, the so-called Atlantic Alliance, and in order to preclude any participation in these organizations and in the political life by left-wing forces such as the communist parties. It was to shove them aside and to isolate them so that development of Europe for as many generations as possible could be brought under the control of those forces which are friendliest to the United States and to the interest of our corporations, which were moving in part and parcel with the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. The CIA works through the reactionary forces, essentially, or the middle roading or the social democratic forces, whichever ones they're trying to support. They work through these people. In the CIA, there is a distinction made between the career U.S. citizen employees, like I was, that is the officers and staff, and the people who actually do the work at the end of the line, who are the agents. At any one time, down in Ecuador, we had on our payroll or in an intimate working relationship with our station, one vice president, a president of the Chamber of Deputies, a president of the Senate, a vice president of the Senate, a number of senators, a number of deputies, the Secretary General of the Democratic Socialist Party. We even created a party down there which we called the Popular Revolutionary Liberal Party, which would appeal to a lot of different people. We had extensive propaganda operations during this period also. The outstanding liberal columnist of the country, Gustavo Salgado, who wrote for El Comercio, which was one of the principal dailies, under pen names, working for us, writing up our material and publishing it as if it were his own. We would publish small notices which would be practically hysterical outcries against the growth of communism in Ecuador or a specific issue such as the visit of diplomats from some communist country. Our participation consisted in creating the conditions of fear and at times hysteria with regard to the growth of the left-wing political organizations in Ecuador, such as the communist organizations, and the fear with regard to the influence of the Cuban Revolution. Our themes were the threat of these developments to traditional Ecuadorian values. And when I speak of Ecuador, I am speaking of most of the rest of Latin America too. The family, religion, and tradition, essentially. The use of forged documents and false documents is another area in which the CIA can bring about a very timely effect. In Ecuador, for example, we at one point wanted to expose the preparations for guerrilla activity of a particular organization, and while one of its leaders was in Cuba on a trip, we wrote up what would appear to be, the way we wrote it, his report to the Cubans. We put this report in a toothpaste tube. This was planted in his luggage when he returned on this trip and discovered by our people in the Treasury Ministry, and he was immediately thrown into jail. And when the report was finally published in the newspapers, it caused a sensation all across the country. We were able to force the Ecuadorian government to break relations with Cuba, and at the same time we were able to promote repression of left-wing political organizations, eventually establishing a military junta which took over in July of 1963. Every CIA station during that period, and I would expect today, was required to maintain what was called the Subversive Control Watch List. This was a list of the most important left-wing political activists in the city or in the country, and the list would include not only their name, but the name of their mother, the name of their father, of their children, of their wife, their address where they lived, the address where they worked, the places they would go with their friends, clubs they might belong to, where they would undertake their leisure activities, everything we might need to know for sudden action against that person. These lists would be usually maintained in the CIA offices and kept up to date, but whenever necessary, they were turned over to the local police or the local military authorities for action on the part of those authorities. In Chile from 1972 to 1973, the same sorts of operations were going on there to make it impossible for the Allende regime to govern after earlier attempts to prevent him from taking office failed, such as the assassination of General Snyder and the attempts to bribe the Chilean Congress. Later on, with the help of the international lending institutions and those financial institutions controlled as part of the United States government, were able to exert the financial squeeze on Chile, which resulted in great difficulty in obtaining short-term credits, creating scarcity of many different types of products. Then such organizations as the Truckers Union had legitimate grievances on which to base their complaint. The CIA, by financing the truck drivers and the shopkeepers and the other organizations, professionals, for example, who organized against the Allende regime, were able to create the conditions and the appearances of chaos and disorganization which will always appeal to right-wing, discipline-minded military leaders who will intervene and justify their intervention on the restoration of national order, of the restoration of national dignity, and the obtention of peace. And this, in the case of Chile, of course, and many other countries, is the peace of the grave for a lot of people. We have government agencies like the Congress, the Senate Committee, for example, to oversee the CIA, talking about the agency now being under control and that the abuses of the past have now been eliminated, as if the agency wasn't under control all along, and as if what they call abuses weren't ordered by presidents. The main argument is not with the agency, which is an instrument for policy execution, but the main argument is with the president and the people outside the CIA who determine the interests which have to be protected and how, who determine American foreign policy, and then call upon the CIA and other agencies to execute that policy. What I would like to know, and I know many other people would like to know too, is not only the history but the current relations between the CIA and the SAVAK in Iran, for example. Imagine all the Iranians who would like to know that. With the Kopkamtib in Indonesia. Imagine the 100,000 political prisoners or so in Indonesia right now who are being held without trial, and have been some for over 10 years, by this security service, which has had its history of relationships with the CIA. Whether the institutional relationship continues with the Korean CIA right now, with the DINA in Chile, with the DOPS and the CODI and the other organizations in Brazil, with the Uruguayan security services, with the Argentine Federal Police there. All of these relationships of the past probably continue today in one degree or another. And I don't see how the Carter administration or any other administration can talk about human rights while these institutional contacts remain, and while these services receive, in one degree or another, support, guidance, and encouragement from the CIA.